And welcome everybody to another episode of Tidal Flooding Talk, brought to you by the New Jersey Coastal Coalition and our broadcast partner at Triax 57 News. You can catch new episodes every Tuesday wherever you are on social media. Every once in a while we have a very special guest, some more special than others, and we're really happy today to bring on the director of the National Hurricane Center to talk about New Jersey and hurricane season, Dr. Michael Brennan. We'll have him in just a minute here. But Dan, I'll kick it over to you. It's our meteorologist only episode, although, I think having the director of National Hurricane Center is a little above my pay grade.
Yeah, I think there's no better guest to kick off hurricane season. June 1st to November 30th. Of course, you can always start a little earlier or go a little past those deadlines. But yeah, no one better. And, National Hurricane Center works so hard at, spreading awareness, preparing us for the season. And then, of course, they prove their worth during the season with the forecast they put out. And the preparedness, the forecasting during and after the storm, just no better guest to have than who we have today. So really looking forward to the next 30 minutes conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll make one programming note, too, before we get into this. We are recording this on May 14th. So the National Hurricane Center's forecast will be out by the time you hear this. And you can find that at hurricanes.gov. So, if we're talking and something seems a little different than what you've probably seen covered in the news by that time, it's probably because of the timing of this. But otherwise, I think a lot of this information is going to be things you can take with you all the way through the end of hurricane season, and that's the point of it. So with that being said, we're going to welcome on Dr. Michael Brennan. He is the director of the National Hurricane Center in Miami, managing tropical cyclone and marine forecasts, warnings, and impact-based decision support services. He was the branch chief of the NHC's specialist unit and a senior hurricane specialist going all the way back to 2008. He's earned his Bachelor of Science, Master's in Science, and PhD in Atmospheric Sciences from North Carolina State University, researching cyclone precipitation, and is also an associate editor for the American Meteorological Society journals. Dr. Brennan, Mike, I know you said to call you Mike. Welcome to Tidal Flooding Talk. We really appreciate you having the time to come on and talk with us here.
Yeah, great to be with you both today.
Awesome. So, first question for you, growing up, were you just always interested in hurricanes, or were you just interested in weather and then made your way into hurricanes?
Yeah, there may be a little bit of both. I think like most meteorologists, I had an early interest in weather going back as far as I can remember. I grew up in southwestern Virginia in the Roanoke area along I-81, Blue Ridge Mountains. And one of my earlier weather memories is a significant flood we had there in early November 1985. I was about 7 years old, and that was actually the flood of record on the Roanoke River. My grandmother lost her home in the event, so it was really impactful to me as a young kid. And it was actually partly due to the remnants of a hurricane that made landfall along the Gulf Coast. So there was an early connection there, but growing up in the mid-latitudes, I was pretty interested in all sorts of weather, winter weather, severe weather, hurricanes, not the direct landfall, but a lot of the impacts from inland storms. So yeah, just like most other Mets, pretty early interest in the career.
Yeah, I tell people if you lined up 10 meteorologists in a row and asked them how long you've been interested in weather for, I'd say 7 out of 10 would say since like middle school or earlier. And that might even be a little low. I'm not even sure on that. But good to have you. And I was always interested in hurricanes myself. I used to draw like Africa and Europe, like hand drawn, and then on the Weather Channel, on the tropical updates, I would plot them when I was growing up. So it's, I don't know, something about the tropics for me too. Dan, I'll kick it over to you.
Yeah, Mike, it was Hurricane Gloria, 9-year-old kid in Rhode Island. Our Hurricane Gloria threw a tree on my house. And, that's why I'm a meteorologist today. I've been fascinated with East Coast hurricanes and, all hurricanes. I mean, they're just so impactful. And you mentioned it, too. This was a question I had kind of saved up for later. It's not just the storm itself and where it makes landfall. It's the remnants. And we've seen that recently, too. Ida, and so many storms. I'm in Pennsylvania now, Agnes, and just the storm, yes, is an ocean-based storm. And yes, that landfalling point is important and the coast can suffer the most extreme impacts. But, people who live hundreds and hundreds of miles inland, are definitely susceptible to tropical weather and the threats they bring.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Hurricane Helene last year was a poster child example for that, with the vast majority of the fatalities, the catastrophic impacts from the flooding and the winds. A lot of them happened well inland in portions of Georgia, now South Carolina, Western North Carolina. There were significant coastal impacts in Florida where the storm made landfall, but the fatality count there was relatively low. The vast majority of the impacts happened well inland. You mentioned Ida, landfall in Louisiana with only a handful of direct fatalities there, but more than 20 up into New Jersey, the New York metropolitan area, again, from the heavy rainfall. And most of the hurricane landfalls we've seen in the United States, we've had 25 going back to 2017. Almost all of them have been along the Gulf Coast. But those storms, even though they've made landfall largely in Florida and along the Gulf Coast, have brought a lot of impacts up into the mid-Atlantic and the Northeast states, primarily in the form of that heavy rainfall, which has almost nothing to do with how strong the storm is or whether it's got a name anymore. It's just a matter of how hard it rains in one location and for how long. And that has more to do with how fast the system's moving and how the rainfall patterns present themselves than anything that has to do with how strong the storm is from a wind perspective.
And Mike, do you, as a follow-up question, how challenging is the messaging for you folks at the Hurricane Center? Obviously, when the storm is 150-mile-an-hour winds, you have hurricane warnings flying and storm surge warnings flying. The media is all over the coast, but they're not necessarily going to be hundreds of miles inland, hyping up the potential devastation that awaits there. So how challenging is the messaging for you guys, for the inland folks, and how have you met those challenges?
Yeah, it can be a challenge because, like you said, the coastal impacts are really important. And storm surge, as everybody along the New Jersey coast who remembers Sandy knows, has the potential to, still devastate coastal communities and kill pretty much the largest number of people that can die in a single day from a hurricane, from that particular hazard. So there's a huge amount of effort and attention that goes into getting people out of harm's way, especially out of those storm surge evacuation zones. But you're right, the threat doesn't end there. So it's not an or, but an and. You have to pay attention to the coastal impacts and the inland impacts. And, during Helene, NOAA took the unprecedented step of putting out a press release to the general media out ahead of Helene's landfall that said, this storm is going to have catastrophic impacts, hundreds of miles away from where it makes landfall, really focusing in on what happened up in Western North Carolina, but also highlighting the significant wind damage and power outages that occurred across much of the interior southeastern U.S. So it's always a messaging challenge. Like you said, the big hurricane with the eye, and it's a category 4 or 5, gets lots of attention leading up to that landfall. But we've made a substantial effort, not just at the Hurricane Center, but elsewhere in the Weather Service and the larger weather enterprise, to really hit those impacts on the inland side. Because if you look back at the fatalities we've seen in the United States going back to 2013, more than half of them are from freshwater flooding, again, that can affect areas well inland days after landfall. And that's been by far the biggest killer that we've seen in the U.S. from tropical storms and hurricanes since going back to 2013.
To your point, Mike, even though we are the New Jersey Coastal Coalition, we do have towns that are inland that are part of the coalition as well because of the freshwater flooding, or even maybe, tidal flooding that's along some of the rivers as well that's not immediately on the coast. All right, so let's get to the $64,000 question, and that is, hurricane season, right? So we said at the top, we don't have the official NOAA National Hurricane Center forecast out yet, but I'm sure you probably have a good idea of what's going to be in there. Where are we at in terms of that and what we could expect this season?
Yeah, well, there's always first I'll preface it by saying that no matter what any seasonal hurricane forecast says, everybody in New Jersey and everybody anywhere in any hurricane-prone area has to be ready to be affected every year, because while we may have some skill in predicting how busy the season's going to be overall, again, across the entire Atlantic basin, the Gulf, the Caribbean, we can't tell until a few days ahead of time, until we have a storm, what areas might necessarily be affected. So we could have a busy season and get effects. We could have a not busy season overall and still have a storm affect your area. But overall, El Nino and La Nina, that pattern of warm and cool ocean waters over the Eastern Pacific, is one of the strongest predictors as to how an Atlantic hurricane season is going to play out. This year, we're likely not having either of them in place, at least for most of the season. So that means that the conditions in the Atlantic, besides El Nino, how warm are the ocean temperatures? What does the wind shear look like, or the change in wind speed direction with height? what do the moisture and wind profiles across the basin look like? That's what's really going to determine the overall character of the season. So again, there are going to be storms. I can definitely tell you that. And our forecast doesn't come out until after we talk here today. But again, the message is that, we've been really busy for a long time. As I mentioned, we've had 25 hurricane landfalls in the U.S. since 2017. That risk is going to be there again every year, and people need to get ready.
Awesome. We're going to take a brief break. We'll come back on the other side. We have plenty more with Director Brennan here on Tidal Flooding Talk. Thanks to the New Jersey Coastal Coalition, your flood insurance bills are lower and your streets safer from the reality of flooding. Since beginning in 2013, we build more resilient shoreline communities. Our member towns develop and share in best practices that anticipate future concerns and create flooding solutions. From our town-specific free web app for flooding information to our weekly Tidal Flooding Talk show, we focus on flooding 24/7. Visit www.njcoastalcoalition.com for more. And we are back with Tidal Flooding Talk. Director of the National Hurricane Center, Mike Brennan, here. We were talking about the hurricane season forecast. One thing I feel like has risen a little more into public consciousness over the past couple of hurricane seasons is the Saharan dust or Saharan air layer, and how, it goes from Saharan Africa across, westerly all the way even to Florida and the Southeast. Is there anything you could tell us about that going into this season, influencing the hurricane forecast?
Yeah, it's sort of an episodic thing that tends to peak in sort of the middle of the summer, the July to August timeframe, where you have a really strong easterly jet that comes off the coast of Africa. And it's not just at the surface, but up into the mid-level, say, 10,000 feet off the ground. And it can push not just the dust, and you can see the dust in satellite imagery, but the dust is really being indicative of a really warm, dry, dusty air mass. And that tends to suppress thunderstorm development out across the sort of main development region of the deep tropical Atlantic. And these dust pulses come off every few days, and that can create a temporary environment that's not very favorable for thunderstorm formation or for a tropical wave to go on and to develop into a tropical depression or tropical storm. And if you remember the 2024 season, we sort of had a really inactive August into early September, and there was a lot of sort of unfavorable conditions out across the deep tropical Atlantic. Some of it was the dust. There was a lot of sinking motion. So that sort of resulted in that long pause in the hurricane season, but then it picked right back up again as we got into late September and continued all the way even into November. But you're right, that dust comes all the way across. In South Florida here where we are, you'll get these kind of hazy, milky skies. Every once in a while, you'll actually see the dust deposited on your car, but it's sort of an episodic thing. It's a pretty routine thing that happens in the summer in the tropical Atlantic.
And Mike, I mean, it's one of the so many factors that go into the seasonal hurricane forecast. Like you mentioned, El Nino, La Nina, the dust, the water temperatures. Yet, I think of all the forecasts, as meteorologists, Joe and I try to put out winter forecasts. I think that's so challenging and sometimes not worth the effort. But the hurricane forecasts have some skill, especially in terms of predicting how busy a season is. Maybe not so much where the storms are going to go. Meteorology isn't that advanced yet, but I think it's one of the most useful long-range forecasts we have. Number one, because it has kind of earned some public respect, and rightfully so, because you guys are very good, I think, at nailing how busy a season we're going to have. And also, it just starts the awareness. Here we are in May, season hasn't started yet, but we're already talking about it. And when that forecast is released, it's on every newscast, it's on social media. It starts people thinking, okay, what's ahead for the season? So I think, you guys would be commended for that skill. And let me just ask you this, following up, how is there any possibility of improving, what part of the basin? Where is it going to be an East Coast year? Is it going to be a Gulf year? How are we coming as far as the science goes, kind of trying to improve that part of the long range forecast?
Yeah, one of the challenges with the seasonal forecast is it really focuses in on those sort of classic hurricanes that develop in the deep tropics, that sort of main development region that stretches from the west coast of Africa across to the Caribbean. There's not as much skill in predicting how storms form at higher latitudes. Say, once you get up into the subtropics or even into the mid latitudes, like say off the coast of the mid-Atlantic or northeast coast, we occasionally get storms will form up there. We really don't have a lot of predictability in sort of how that plays into the season. So that's one of the challenges, is the large scale climate signals and patterns that play into the seasonal outlook are really confined to those sort of classical deep tropical systems. And as you mentioned, where a storm forms has a lot to do with where it's going to go. And that's largely determined by the steering patterns that are present at that particular time. Now, certainly you could have a season where, the Bermuda high is stronger. It might shift the tracks a little farther west, where it's weaker, and you might have more storms recurred, but we don't have a lot of skill yet in being able to forecast those types of patterns and those types, especially landfall probabilities or anything like that at this point. But that's something that, in coming years, we may be able to get a little more skillful at.
Mike, when every year National Hurricane Center usually puts out a list of updates or improvements from previous years, can you walk us through those for this year?
Sure. Yeah, there's a couple that I probably would want to try to highlight. The first one is actually one we started last year, the experimental cone graphic that we rolled out in mid-hurricane season last year. That the thing that's different about that graphic is it shows the inland extent of the tropical storm and hurricane watches and warnings over the United States. So for a storm like Helene, it wouldn't just show the coastal watches and warnings, which we've always shown, but it showed almost the entire state of Florida and almost all of Georgia and parts of the Carolinas under those tropical storm and hurricane watches and warnings to better convey that inland wind risk. And that product will be available again this season. A couple other things that we're changing is going to be the concept of potential tropical cyclones, where we are able to issue forecasts and watches and warnings for systems that aren't yet tropical depressions or tropical storms. We've had the ability to do that since 2017. We've used it an awful lot. This year, we're going to have the option to start issuing those products even a little sooner, as up to 72 hours before we could see hazards like wind or storm surge affect land areas. So that'll allow us to get those forecasts out a little sooner, especially for storms that form near land, like in the Gulf or the Caribbean. Think back to Helene last year. Occasionally we have storms form off the East Coast that could bring hazards again within a couple of days, and it gets that forecast information out sooner. The other thing you'll see on hurricanes.gov that's new this year is sort of a large-scale rip current risk viewer, and that's a really important thing for folks along the New Jersey shore. Rip currents have been an underrated killer in tropical storms and hurricanes over the last few years, and actually, I'm looking at our statistics right now. They're actually the third leading cause of direct fatalities in tropical storms and hurricanes since 2013, responsible for more than 70 deaths. And in New Jersey, all the direct fatalities have been either due to freshwater flooding or rip currents. And the rip current fatalities are really concentrated in states with East Coast facing beaches, Florida, North Carolina, and New Jersey. They're all three kind of right up there in rip current risk. And having that rip current risk highlighted on hurricanes.gov will help people and be one more way for people to know that, hey, it might not be safe to get in the water when you go to the beach, and a great reminder to folks to not get into the ocean if you don't think it's safe to do so.
Excellent. And that's a good point, too, the rip currents. I think it was one year, Mike, if I'm not mistaken, in the early 2000s, where rip currents were the leading cause, weather fatality of anything across the country, like tornadoes, hurricanes. Yeah. It beat them all out. Granted, it was a quiet year, but it is kind of an underrated threat. There could be hurricanes hundreds of miles off the East Coast, and you still have a threat, especially on the beaches you highlighted. But it's nice to see the Hurricane Center is always improving their products, always trying to increase their messaging. And as a New Jersey resident, I know some things that have come out of Sandy or storms back in the 2010s that are great, valuable products today. Number one, the storm surge warnings. Yeah. I mean, that's something that wasn't issued, 15, 20 years ago. But with storm surge being so huge, I mean, that's probably one of the most important and valuable products you issue now, right?
Yeah, exactly. The storm surge warning sort of started to get thought about after Katrina in 2005, but then we had Ike in 2008, Sandy in 2012. Prior to 2017, the threat of storm surge was really sort of contained within the hurricane warning. But now, since 2017, we've been able to issue a separate watch or warning to highlight those areas at the risk of life-threatening inundation from the ocean water moving onto normally dry land. And because it's not always lined up with where the wind threat is the greatest. So you can think about if we had another event like a Sandy, we would have storm surge watches and warnings up for parts of the Jersey Shore. They can, again, extend well inland, not just immediate barrier islands, but up rivers and into bays and creeks. And again, the important thing about the storm surge warning is it's really meant to support evacuation decisions that are made by local emergency managers. And again, remind people that, hey, if you've been asked to leave, here's another reason to get out. That storm surge warning is going to go off as a wireless emergency alert on your phone. It's going to target where you're located and let you know that you're at risk of that inundation.
Okay, thank you. And again, we are talking with National Hurricane Center Director Mike Brennan. We're going to be back with our third and final segment of Tidal Flooding Talk right after this. Stay with us. And welcome back to Tidal Flooding Talk. Meteorologist Joe Martucci and myself having a great conversation with National Hurricane Center Director Mike Brennan ahead of the start of the Atlantic hurricane season, June 1st to November 30th every year. And Mike, here in New Jersey, we don't get many hurricane landfalls. In fact, they are very, very few and far between. And with the gaps sometimes of how impacts that we sometimes see, people can let their guard down. If you're not here to experience a storm, sometimes you're not aware of the vulnerability of the Jersey Shore. So how do you keep up that awareness, in those kind of quiet cycles? We always hope for those quiet cycles as meteorologists, but things can turn noisy very quickly. So how do you keep the residents aware during quiet times?
Yeah, it's a constant re-education effort every year because, like you said, you have people who may have lived in a place where they haven't had a lot of experience with a tropical storm or hurricane directly for a while, or even in areas that have them more frequently, you have population changes, people moving in and out of areas. I live in Southeast Florida. We haven't had a direct hurricane impact here since 2005. In the greater Miami metro area. We had Irma in 2017, but I've lived here the entire time I've lived here. I've never really experienced a hurricane here in Southeast Florida. That's one of the most hurricane prone areas in the country. So as you go farther north along the East Coast, those events generally become less and less frequent in terms of sort of the direct, hurricane impacts that we might see along the Jersey Shore or up into the northeastern U.S. But that risk is absolutely there. And it's so important to remind people that no matter how long you've lived in an area, you could have lived your whole life in a particular location, you have probably not seen the worst thing that can happen there in terms of flooding, in terms of wind damage, storm surge, just because those very worst conditions come along so infrequently. But that's what that risk is. And it's all about understanding your risk and knowing the risks of where you live, where you work, people you care about, understand what their risks look like. That's why it's so important to do that as we head into the hurricane season, so that when a storm threatens you, you're not trying to figure out your risk then. At that point, you want to have an action plan, a hurricane plan that you can put in place, get to a safe place, keep yourself, your loved ones, your possessions safe. And that's why it's so important to do that now so that you're not figuring it out when a storm threatens.
Dan and I have our great trivia question, which is, when was the last time New Jersey was directly hit by a hurricane? And no one usually gets it right, but it was 1903 was the last time New Jersey had it directly.
No one's around who was there then. We know that. So, it is one of those things within living memory. You haven't seen that happen, but nobody had seen a storm like Sandy happen until it happened either.
Right.
And then you take the 1938 hurricane that made landfall on Long Island. That's, again, a storm of record. But it can come along infrequently, but that risk is absolutely there. And you think about now, how many more people are there? How much more stuff is there? The risk profile continues to grow in coastal communities in the United States. because we have more people, we have more things, the potential for loss of life, economic impact continues to grow every year.
Yeah, and we say that at the coalition, it's great to come to the Jersey Shore 360 days a year, but there's going to be those 5 with tidal flooding that's significant, and every once in a while, some kind of tropical system or remnant storm that comes. But I want to ask you this, and I'll just say it. My question is, if Sandy was to happen today in 2025, what would be different in terms of the approach, or what kind of watchers or warnings would be issued, for residents here?
Yeah, at this point, if we had a storm like Sandy, we would likely put up hurricane and storm surge watches and warnings, even for a system that was in some sort of transitioning state. We right after Sandy, within the next couple of years, we sort of gave ourselves that ability through what we call post-tropical cyclones to be able to keep tropical watches and warnings up through that sort of change in structure of the storm. And I think that would definitely help with the messaging. Again, and now we have a storm surge warning that we didn't have at all back in 2012. So we'd be able to better highlight and give people a much better idea in terms of graphics and products, what kind of inundation they would need to prepare for, not just the general public, but in the media, the emergency management community, to be able to visualize what that flooding footprint could look like and help make better evacuation decisions. And I think, too, like our forecasts are a lot better now, 13 years later than Sandy, in terms of our ability to not just forecast track, which has always been steadily improving, but our ability to forecast intensity and even structural changes is much better than it was, 10 or 15 years ago. So I think overall the messaging would be better. We have different ways to try to reach people. We do a lot more on things like social media and live streams and have better products and services to kind of provide across the board. And we have a much better focus within the National Weather Service in particular in supporting decision support services to emergency managers, not just from here at the Hurricane Center, but also from our partners at our local weather forecast offices, like the one in Mount Holly or the one in Upton and Long Island that cover the New Jersey coastline. And so I think in general, the messaging and the information would be improved compared to what it would have been during Sandy.
I mean, one of the great things about, not many two great things about hurricanes, but one of the luxuries you guys normally have, especially with those long track storms you mentioned, is time.
Right.
You track them off Africa, 10, 12 days sometimes of watching and kind of alerting the public. Is there a fair, and you mentioned like the Long Island hurricane, and I grew up in New England and, studied that intensively. I mean, that roared up the coast and no one knew it was coming. Like if you have a home brew, something close to the coast, something that develops off the Carolinas where you may not have that type of lead time, what type of challenges does that kind of give you guys? And how did you change your approach where instead of 10 days of hype and advance warning, you might have like a day or two?
Yeah, you talk about things that keep me up at night. That's the scenario of storm that really keeps me up at night, and I think is one of the biggest risks we have in the United States. Storms that form in the western part of the basin can form, rapidly intensify, because storms that rapidly strengthen tend to do so early in their life cycle. And then you can have a storm that develops in the Bahamas, and then like the 38 storm can rocket up the coast and make landfall in the mid-Atlantic states within a day or two. So in fact, if you go back and look at the Gulf Coast, the strongest hurricanes that have ever hit the United States on the Gulf Coast and Florida have all formed within about 3 or 4 days of landfall. You're thinking about Michael, Andrew, Laura, Ida. These are all systems that were tropical storms 3 days prior to making landfall. So they're all systems that form, rapidly intensify, and then make landfall quickly. And again, those Gulf Coast storms can then bring those inland impacts all the way up into the mid-Atlantic states. So they can be a risk as well. A storm like Helene was a great example of that last year too. So it goes to, again, preparation, because not every storm is going to be, most storms are not those really long track classical hurricanes like a Floyd from 99 or Fran of 96 or Irma, where you have a whole week to watch them lumber across the Atlantic, lots of time to think and get ready. The biggest threat comes from those shorter fuse events where you, again, only have 3 or 4 days maybe. That's why it's so important to know your risk and have your plan so you can just put it into action when a storm threatens.
Awesome. Well, Mike, this is all fantastic information. Sometimes we always wish we have an hour for these, but we really appreciate you chatting with us here. Any final words from you about New Jersey and hurricane season before we get into the one thing we can't stop talking about, flooding or otherwise?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, it goes back to the fact that it doesn't take a direct landfall to bring very significant impacts. And it's almost always the water hazards that are responsible for the vast majority of fatalities: storm surge, freshwater flooding, rip currents. One other thing I'll mention is just that, the impact of wind gusts and the causes that they can produce in terms of fatalities and damage are almost always due to trees. And, when you get up into the Northeast or mid-Atlantic states, the storms may not be really strong from a wind perspective anymore. They might not be a hurricane. The sustained winds might be 30 or 40 miles an hour. People might think, oh, they can get out and go outside in that type of environment. But then you get a 70-mile-an-hour wind gust that takes a tree branch down, and it could fall on you in your car or in your home or outside. And we lose almost all of the wind fatalities are due to those types of tree falls. So it's just, again, be mindful of what your risk is and be prepared as you head into the season, and really keep an eye on the water hazards, because they are typically the deadliest.
Very important information there for sure. All right, so we have about a minute left. We're going to do, like I said, one thing we can't stop talking about, coastal flooding or otherwise. Mike, I'll turn it over to you as the guest. You can start off first.
Sure. Well, you think about coastal flooding and storm surge, and another thing to remember for the residents of New Jersey is it doesn't take a storm making landfall in New Jersey to create a lot of storm surge or coastal flooding along the Jersey Shore or up the Delaware River. You can have those impacts from a storm that is moving offshore or makes landfall in another location. So don't let your guard down, even if the storm's not pointed directly at where you live.
Awesome. Dan?
I was going to thank the National Hurricane Center. Mike, we kind of bucked the trend, and we vacation in the tropics in hurricane season. So we go to Punta Cana in October every year. Haven't got hit yet. Hoping the luck doesn't run out this year. But I love your 2 to 3 week product where it kind of keys in on areas that may or may not develop. And I start looking at that as we get towards the fall. But I thank you for that product. And that's something I'll be talking about all summer.
I should be looking at that product too. Although by the time you're listening to this, I would have already have been in South Florida, going to Sunny Isles Beach from the 17th to the 20th. So I'm here to tell my past self that you had an excellent time in Florida. It was great, and you're nice and tan now that we're Memorial Day weekend. So there we go. Excellent. Well, again, Director Brennan, thanks so much for being on. We really appreciate it. Hurricanes.gov is the website. We'll hope to hear from you soon, but hopefully not too soon, because that would mean something's brewing. But we appreciate all your work at the National Hurricane Center.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks so much.